Okay. Hello and welcome to State of the Builder at Scale. Today, we're talking about an environmental pressure that we're facing as founders, and that is that there is more activity than ever before, but less certainty. We're not quite sure what's working and what's not working. So let's get into it. So there was a time when more visibility, more content, more tools, more reporting was enough to make the business easier to understand. But what's happening now in this environment with founders is that even though there is a lot of activity and it's easier to create a lot of activity, that activity is not necessarily providing more clarity into what's driving the results. Oops. So naturally, as founders, we do more activity, more content, more tools, more reporting. But, and it's not because we're failing, it's because we're trying to stabilize the movement, understand what is driving results in a more volatile environment. Oops, I'm ahead. So you may have seen this post this week where we say, oh, Jill, her post crushed it. So you're out there and you have a post and it does really well. You get engagement, you get some conversations in the DM and comments, and you think that it's amazing. And so then, of course, what we want to do is we want to capture that momentum, right? So what happens is we do more of the same, more posts, more visibility, more content. But you get to a point, maybe it's 90 days in, and you realize that the momentum and the revenue that you were expecting from that additional activity and from that spike, it doesn't really materialize. So let's a second. So what's happening inside this environment that we're in is that movement, it doesn't really generate the results we're looking for. And you're scratching your head like, wait, I did more. I did all these different activities, but the system did not deliver on what I was expecting, right? It's much harder. It's easier to create movement, but it's much harder to interpret that movement. And what's interesting is that you can have, look at my notes. What's interesting is that you can have the exact same symptom for two different businesses, and they actually require a different solution. So there's no more one size fits all solutions. It was easier before because there were only a few different things you could select from. You add more team, maybe you add some technology. And it's not that we don't have those things, but we have a lot more of them. And so it's much more difficult to be able to even identify which one is really going to move the needle for the business. And the key there is that you can have two completely different businesses. And we'll just look at an example. As a matter of fact, let's just look at this example. I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's take a simple symptom, like your leads aren't converting. So you have demand, your leads aren't converting. Two different businesses. One Business A, they say, ah, you know what? I need to hire a closer. Leads aren't converting. They hire a closer, everything takes off. That was the answer for them. But you can look at another business and they have the exact same symptom. My leads are not converting. They implement the same solution. I hired a better closer, but it doesn't move the needle for them. And why is that? Because the symptoms matched, but the underlying constraint did not, right? So that's why, as a founder, I can copy some good advice. I can get great strategies from other founders, and I can implement good systems, but yet not get the result that I'm looking for and destabilize the revenue, destabilize the business because it's not the origin for my business. It was a solution for someone else's constraint, not my constraint. If that makes sense. So, this is another reason why advice should stay advice. If you're a Bible reader, with many advisors, plans succeed. But in this environment, we have to evaluate that advice in the context of what is happening inside our business, right? Let's see. So that's why founder conversations, masterminds, groups, and advisors, and a lot of those things give you really great advice. But then you go off and do the exact same thing and it doesn't work for you. Not because it was bad advice, not because it didn't work for maybe a lot of people, but it has to be aligned with the constraint that exists in your business at the stage that you're at in that moment. So great advice, not necessarily your advice in that moment, right? Different origins. So, so this is why mapping matters. This is why mapping matters, because the goal is not more random activities. The goal is, one, we need to identify what the origin is of the constraint. Where does the instability originate? The second thing is we need to understand, how does that instability flow through our system? What is destabilizing within the system as a result, right? And then where does that instability create the most revenue drag, right? What has the most impact? And finally, once we identify that, now what is it that we should focus on addressing that will have the most impact, right? And it deserves reinforcement and fixing. So in the archetypes of scale series, what we're looking at here is patterns, because when we can identify patterns in our business, it helps us to understand where to focus. And in an environment where the instability or the pressure results from more activity and less certainty, there's several different patterns at play. In this room, we take a look at one, not to solve it, just to identify it so that you can recognize these patterns when they happen in your business. One such pattern is this activity attribution drift, which is basically when activity is increasing faster than reinforcement confidence. In other words, I'm doing a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm not sure what's driving the results, right? That's what this pattern is about. And we will, so next week, so what we will do with the spotlight pattern, lost my place. So with the spotlight pattern, we take a look, a deep dive each week on whichever pattern that we spotlight, and we look at how that pattern affects the business from both the mechanics of it as well as actual proof, numbers of how it impacts the business. And that is the Profit Visibility Lab. So in the lab, which is on Tuesday at 6:30, this is where we dig deeper. So for this pattern, we look at how reinforcement confidence collapses. Like when do we get to a point where we're looking at the activity and just scratching our heads like, okay, that's really, that ad campaign, that, that event, that advertisement, whatever it was, it didn't really land the way I thought it would. We're going to look at that. We're going to look at what happens when we scale false positives. So in this Jill example, it's like, hey, that was amazing. I'm going to scale it. And then, oh, that really didn't work. And we're also going to look at attribution, throughput, and stability. In other words, how do we understand what activity is driving result? That's Tuesday at 6:30 in the Profit Visibility Lab. Registration is required for that one. So as we wrap up, one thought I want to leave with you is that the business can be moving, right? The business is moving, in fact, but the confidence in what is actually driving the results, which is what we need to create repeatable revenue. We need to understand what is actually driving the results we're seeing. That can be weakening underneath, right? And so when that's happening, it becomes harder to see what is creating instability in the business. And it makes it very easy to scale the wrong thing with confidence. To scale the wrong thing with confidence. So I'll leave you with that thought, and I'll see you next time on Profit Visibility Lab.